At Winfield Hall, a marble staircase was said to have cost $2 million. The estate occupied 16 acres in Glen Cove. The house contained roughly 56 rooms. Its marble walls, gold leaf ceilings, greenhouses, terraces, carriage house, and monumental entrance arch belonged to a private world built from the profits of the simplest promise in American retail. 5 cents, 10 cents, nothing more. A later estate story says the proprietor sometimes walked through those rooms in a borrowed Napoleonic uniform, beneath a bicorne hat, and sat on a red and gold throne. The costume episode hasn't been confirmed by contemporary diaries, staff memoirs, or business records. His fascination with Napoleon is documented. His office in the Woolworth Building was called the Empire Room. It contained Napoleonic furniture, portraits, busts, and symbols. In 1913, the owner's tower rose 792 feet above Lower Manhattan. By 1929, the chain associated with his name was reported to have more than 2,100 stores across 5 countries. In 1935, the directors abandoned the fixed price limits that had made the chain famous. In 1997, the last American Woolworth stores closed. The mansion remained. The counter disappeared. This is the story of how Woolworth made ordinary shopping almost effortless, and how its own scale made that simple promise harder to renew. This deep dive carries forward the structure of the Sambo's episode: an intimate opening, a reconstruction of the peak, familiar explanations for decline, and a final look at the operating system beneath the story. On April 13, 1852, Frank Winfield Woolworth was born on a farm near Rodman in Jefferson County, New York. His family lived with modest means. At about 16, he left school and went to work. He found employment in dry goods stores around Watertown, including Augsbury and Moore, later known as Moore and Smith. The work wasn't glamorous. He stocked shelves, he washed windows, he arranged merchandise in the front display. That last task mattered. In a 19th century general store, the window wasn't decoration alone. It was an argument made in glass. A passerby had to notice the goods, understand that they were available, and feel that entering the store would be worthwhile. Woolworth was considered an inept salesman by some accounts. He didn't begin with the easy gift of persuasion. He found a different advantage in arrangement. If the goods were placed properly, they could invite the customer before a clerk had said anything. In September 1875, he took a position with A. Bushnell and Company. The job required him to leave his boarding house and sleep in the store. The hours grew so long that in February 1876 he collapsed from exhaustion and was carried by sleigh to his mother's house. After recovering, he married Jenny Creighton. The marriage took place in the Woolworth family farmhouse. He would eventually build a fortune large enough to surround his family with marble. But the household began with a young clerk who had already learned that fatigue could close a business as effectively as bad merchandise. In 1877, Frank and Jenny moved to Watertown. Woolworth accepted a position at Moore and Smith for $10 a week. The store had too much inventory and too many bills pending. Its owners tried to solve the problem by opening another location in Great Bend, New York. Woolworth was sent to manage it. The floor measured 20 by 60 feet. He arranged the surplus stock carefully. Goods were displayed as attractively as possible. The room was made to look fuller, cleaner, and more inviting than the company's accounts deserved. The store failed in May 1878. Woolworth returned to the Watertown store. The unsold merchandise remained. The financial problem had not vanished. It had merely moved back to the place where it began. A customer suggested a fixed 5-cent counter, similar to one used by a small merchant in Michigan. The idea wasn't wholly new. Fixed-price counters had appeared before Woolworth. The 5 and dime format didn't begin with one solitary invention. What Woolworth recognized was the possibility of turning the counter into a complete retail system. 2 large wooden tables were placed in the middle of the store. The most attractive merchandise was arranged toward the front. A large sign announced that the articles on the table were 5 cents each. The customer could see the goods. The customer could see the price. No bargaining was required. The experiment succeeded. The profit on each item might be only a penny or 2. That left no room for slow movement or careless buying. The counter had to sell a large quantity of inexpensive objects. A small margin, repeated often enough, could pay the rent, repay the loan, cover wages, and produce something more. The price was low. The discipline behind it wasn't. On February 22, 1879, Frank Woolworth opened the Great 5-Cent Store in Utica, New York. That date is accepted by most accounts, although one early biographical source gives the year as 1878. The opening sale is often identified as a tin fire shovel, though that detail is itself reported rather than established by a surviving sales ledger. The store closed in May 1879. Woolworth returned the merchandise to Moore and Smith. He had not created a permanent business in Utica. He had created a test. The location had failed. The format had not. After a month of consideration, Woolworth traveled to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He had $30 with him and sought a place where the 5-cent idea had room to grow. The Lancaster store opened in June 1879. The Woolworths Museum and a New York Times anniversary account placed the opening on June 21st. Another account gives a different date. The calendar is disputed. The first day's result is preserved in a letter to Woolworth's father. "I opened my store here for trade yesterday," he wrote, reporting sales of $127.65. The opening inventory cost roughly $400. The first store had failed. The second one moved. Lancaster became the beginning of the durable company. The 5-cent table soon met the 10-cent line. Sources differ over whether Lancaster carried both price points from its first day or added the 10-cent merchandise shortly afterward. The commercial logic is clear even where the exact sequence isn't. 5 cents brought people inside. 10 cents widened the range. A small tool, a needle case, a spool of thread, a piece of ribbon, a toy, or a household item might fit the first price. A larger, more elaborate, or more costly article could fit the second. The store retained a simple structure because the prices performed the sorting. A customer didn't need to calculate a discount percentage. The price was already printed into the arrangement of the room. The distinction between 5 and 10 wasn't cosmetic. It determined what Woolworth could buy, what manufacturers could produce, how much space an item could occupy, and how quickly that item had to sell. On November 6, 1880, a store opened in Scranton under a banner reading 5 cents and 10 cents Woolworth Bros Store. Charles Sumner Woolworth, Frank's brother, managed the location. Scranton became the place where the 5 and 10 model settled into a recognizable form. The business was no longer only a 5-cent experiment. It was becoming a repeatable assortment organized around two low price points. Frank and Charles didn't build the enterprise alone. Relatives, associates, and other merchants joined a network of related chains. In 1884, Charles partnered with wholesaler Fred Morgan Kirby on a store in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. The stores often looked alike inside and out, while operating under different names. They shared knowledge and, in some cases, purchasing arrangements. Frank Woolworth supplied much of the merchandise and encouraged the chains to combine orders. The arrangement became known as a friendly rival syndicate. Rivalry remained, but some of the waste was removed. Stores avoided unnecessary head-to-head competition in the same locations. By 1914, the leading American variety chains were still largely separated by territory. Woolworth operated 737 stores that year, with sales of $69,619,669. S.S. Kresge operated 118, S.H. Kress operated 118, J.G. McCrory operated 116. The chains were competitors. They were also participating in the same commercial experiment. Each was learning how far a merchant could lower the price when the store was built around movement rather than ceremony. The main advantage wasn't simply that Woolworth sold cheap objects. Other stores could sell individual objects cheaply. The larger advantage was the number of small obstacles the format removed from the act of buying. In many mid-19th century dry goods and general stores, merchandise stayed behind a counter or on high shelves. A customer asked for an article, a clerk retrieved it. Prices weren't always marked on each item. Bargaining and bartering were common. The customer had to ask for the product. The customer had to ask about the price. The customer might have to explain what was wanted in front of a clerk and other shoppers. Woolworth changed the sequence. A customer could enter and scan the table. The merchandise was exposed. Items could be handled and compared. A visible price answered the question of affordability before a conversation began. The store turned a negotiation into a selection. That was especially important for ordinary purchases. The customer didn't need to announce a limited budget. A child could look at a toy. A seamstress could handle sewing goods. A worker could examine a tool. A household could enter for one needed item and discover several others that cost little enough to consider. The products were inexpensive. The experience was dignified. This wasn't modern self-service in the full supermarket sense. Early Woolworth stores didn't necessarily have baskets, long aisles, and a centralized checkout. Clerks still wrapped purchases, made change, and kept counters supplied. But the customer no longer needed a clerk to retrieve every article. That difference was enough to alter the atmosphere of the store. The goods had to sell themselves. Woolworth sales clerks had narrower duties than salespeople in stores built around personal service. They kept the counters orderly, replenished stock, wrapped the purchase, and made change. In an annual letter from 1892, Woolworth wrote, "We must have cheap help, or we can't sell cheap goods." He argued that when a sales clerk became skilled enough to obtain higher wages elsewhere, the company should let her go, because the goods didn't require highly trained salespeople to sell them. The statement was severe. It also exposed the economics of the counter. Woolworth wasn't paying for a long consultation over one expensive item. He was building a room in which thousands of inexpensive items could be seen, chosen, and paid for with minimal assistance. The lower labor requirement supported the lower price. The open display created another problem. Merchandise that customers could handle could also be misplaced, damaged, or stolen. A counter that looked abundant in the morning could appear disordered by afternoon. The manager carried the burden. A manager had to identify the fast sellers and remove the slow ones. A stale line consumed shelf space that could have been given to a product customers actually wanted. The manager had to supervise employees, watch cash, maintain the displays, and keep the store clean enough that low prices didn't look like neglect. The price point made inventory discipline more important, not less. A high-priced item can sometimes survive a long wait on the shelf. A 5-cent item can't contribute much profit 1 unit at a time. It has to move. Woolworth's buyers and managers were therefore joined by a common arithmetic. The buyer selected merchandise that could fit the price. The manager watched whether customers accepted it. Headquarters gathered reports. The store either continued the line or replaced it. By 1900, the chain had grown to 59 stores, with sales above $5 million. The original 5-cent table had become a network of locations, buyers, managers, suppliers, and records. It still looked simple to the customer. Behind the counter, simplicity was being manufactured. In the 1890s, Woolworth expanded its central buying operation in New York. The available record is stronger on the existence of centralized buying than on the exact date of every office. The purpose was straightforward. One store could buy a modest quantity. A chain could promise volume. Woolworth and allied chains bought directly from manufacturers where possible and bypassed wholesalers. The company didn't vertically integrate every product or purchase every article straight from a factory. The supply chain remained mixed, involving manufacturers, imports, wholesalers, and cooperative buying arrangements. But direct purchasing was a major part of the model. The company could order in quantities that smaller merchants couldn't match. It could specify sizes, materials, colors, packaging, or price limits. It could select products that were easy to ship, easy to display, and likely to sell repeatedly. The lower acquisition cost became visible at the counter as a nickel or a dime. This was the hidden side of the sign. A customer saw 5 cents. The company saw factory terms, freight, shelf space, employee time, spoilage, theft, and the speed at which the item would be sold. If the item moved quickly, a small profit could be repeated. If it sat, the price sign couldn't save it. The system required merchandise that was cheap enough to buy, desirable enough to move, and ordinary enough to be needed by many different customers. That is why the assortment was broad, but not random. Household goods could stand beside dry goods. Toys could share space with hardware. Clothing, personal items, school supplies, candy, gifts, jewelry, and seasonal merchandise could appear under one roof. The range changed by period and location. No single Woolworth store carried every category at all times. But the general principle remained: gather many modest needs into one convenient place. A customer might arrive for a spool of thread and leave with a Christmas ornament. A child might enter for a toy and stop at the candy counter. A household could purchase a small tool, a personal item, and a gift without visiting 3 different merchants. Woolworth was making a low-priced department store from objects that didn't require a department store's level of service. the 10-cent line expanded that possibility. A product that couldn't be sold profitably for 5 cents might still work at 10. The second price point allowed the chain to offer greater variety while preserving the clarity of the format. Around 1905, the Lancaster jewellery counter reportedly sold pieces for 10 cents or less. One account describes some articles as containing 24-carat gold. The exact jewellery details rest on a single source and shouldn't be turned into a universal description of Woolworth merchandise. The broader fact is secure. The company used aggressive sourcing and careful selection to make objects associated with higher prices fit a low-price counter. The surprise was part of the attraction. The store didn't promise luxury. It promised that something unexpected might be found without requiring a large payment. Location mattered as much as buying. Woolworth expanded through small towns, mid-sized cities, and downtown streets. The store could be placed near other daily errands. Customers didn't need to travel to a major commercial centre for every household item, school supply, gift, or seasonal purchase. The format worked because the route was short. The customer walked past the window. The price sign made the offer legible. The open display invited inspection. The broad assortment reduced the number of other stores required. The cash transaction ended quickly. In the early period, Woolworth also relied heavily on window displays, price appeal, branding, and word of mouth rather than elaborate press advertising. The location itself performed part of the advertising work. A busy street brought people past the store. A bright display showed them what the store could offer. A crowd suggested that the counter was worth entering. The business paid high rents in some locations because foot traffic was part of the selling system. The store didn't need to persuade every customer with a speech. It needed to be present where customers already moved. By 1904, 6 affiliated chains were operating in the United States and Canada. The corporate structure followed the network. F. W. Woolworth and Company was formally incorporated in February 1905. In 1911, the affiliated chains had 596 stores. In 1912, those operations were brought together under one corporate entity. That was a decisive change. A company with hundreds of stores could no longer run entirely on personal memory. The small counter had become an organization that needed departments, buying offices, reports, accounting systems, and standards. The challenge was now visible. Headquarters needed enough control to make the chain efficient. Local stores needed enough responsibility to respond to the customers in front of them. Central buying could lower costs. It couldn't see which display had become untidy in a particular town. A national price policy could create trust. It couldn't determine whether a local customer needed more sewing goods, more toys, or more hardware. Woolworth had to make a large organization feel like a small, understandable store. The company developed systems to keep those two levels connected. The clearest surviving evidence comes from the British Woolworth operation, which adopted practices associated with the American parent. It shouldn't be assumed that every American store used an identical formula in every decade, but the British records show the kind of local machinery that made the broader chain possible. Branch managers were responsible for store appearance, stock condition, displays, staff, cash receipts, and daily reporting. District managers inspected accounts, displays, stock, and complaints. Receipts were deposited at local banks several times a week. The manager wasn't simply a caretaker of a company-owned room. The manager was expected to make the room perform. Promotion from within was also important. Trainees could begin at stockroom level and rise toward management. Senior executives were described as people who had earned the business from the bottom. In one British company account, trainees known as learners received 50 shillings a week. They were encouraged with the phrase, "How tall can an oak tree grow?" The language was simple. The structure was practical. A person who had worked in the stockroom knew the physical cost of an empty display. A person who had watched customers knew which items were picked up and returned to the table. A person who had handled the daily cash knew that a few cents of profit depended on a large number of completed purchases. Store manager compensation was tied to trading results in the documented British system. One description refers to a weekly drawing allowance of $10, deducted from a percentage of annual store profit. Buyers and senior executives also received profit-linked compensation. The evidence for a single, uniform American compensation formula across all years is limited. The evidence for performance-linked management in the Woolworth system is stronger. This arrangement linked scale to local execution. Headquarters could buy in bulk. The manager had to sell through the stock.
The chain could establish a common format. The manager had to adapt the display to the town. The system didn't grant unlimited autonomy. Managers reported upward. District staff inspected. Accounts were checked. But the local store wasn't an empty shell waiting for instructions from New York. Woolworth's scale worked because responsibilities still reached the counter. By 1909, the format crossed the Atlantic. In Britain, the stores used threepence and sixpence, the nearest local equivalent to 5 and 10 cents. The American price points changed currency. The operating language didn't. Low prices, broad assortment, visible goods, repeated locations, central buying, local responsibility. The model travelled because it wasn't tied to one American product. It was tied to a method of reducing the effort required to buy ordinary things. The business had become portable. In 1910, Frank Woolworth commissioned Cass Gilbert to design a headquarters in Lower Manhattan. The Woolworth Building opened on April 24, 1913. It rose 792 feet above 233 Broadway. It was commonly described as 60 stories, although floor counts varied with the treatment of mechanical levels and galleries. At its opening, it was the tallest building in the world. The cost was approximately $13.5 million, paid in cash. The public called it the Cathedral of Commerce. The name belonged to a company whose earliest breakthrough had been 2 wooden tables and a low price sign. The building wasn't the business. It was the monument produced by the business. At street level, Woolworth still depended on the same sequence. Enter, look, touch, choose, pay. At headquarters, the company dealt in leases, ledgers, buying offices, store reports, and international expansion. On Main Street, the customer encountered a table of inexpensive goods and a price that could be understood immediately. The tower and the counter were different expressions of the same reach. In 1914, Woolworth purchased property in Glen Cove on Long Island. The site already held a villa designed for engineer Alexander Crombie Humphreys. In November 1916, the villa burned. The cause was never definitively established. Later stories suggested dissatisfaction with the earlier house or even deliberate fire, but no documented finding implicates Woolworth. The destroyed furnishings included books and a pipe organ. One account placed the losses at approximately $150,000, including a $20,000 organ. Woolworth commissioned a new house from architect Charles Pierpont Henry Gilbert. The present Winfield Hall was built in the late 1910s. Sources differ on the exact completion date, room count, and whether certain measurements include ancillary structures. The estate itself is well documented. about 32,000 square feet in the main house, roughly 56 rooms, 16 acres. A construction cost usually placed between $9 and $10 million. $2 million for the marble staircase in several accounts. The residence included formal gardens, terraces, greenhouses, outbuildings, and an entrance arch compared with the Arc de Triomphe. Napoleonic symbols appeared in the decoration. Woolworth's office in the tower carried the same fascination through portraits, busts, empire-style furniture, and throne-like chairs. Later estate histories added the image of Woolworth wandering through the rooms in Napoleon's uniform. That episode remains unverified. The confirmed fact is the collecting and the admiration. The contrast is still useful. A merchant who had made a fortune by limiting the customer's choice of price created a private house in which almost every material choice announced excess. A staircase could cost $2 million. A counter item could cost 5 cents. The mansion reveals taste. It does not explain the company's decline. Private extravagance and retail discipline weren't opposites in the world Woolworth built. One concerned the arrangement of marble, symbols, and rooms. The other concerned the arrangement of goods, prices, and customer movement. Both demanded control. On April 8, 1919, Frank Winfield Woolworth died at 66. The recorded cause was septic poisoning from a tooth infection. Accounts differ on the precise place of death. The business continued. By Woolworth's death, the company had more than 1,000 stores in the United States and abroad. The exact number varies because some counts include affiliated and international operations, while others don't. The scale is clearer than the total. In 1925, the company reported sales of $253 million. In 1926, sales were reported at $239 million. In 1929, company materials celebrated more than 2,100 stores across the United States, Canada, Cuba, Germany, and Great Britain. The empire had reached a point at which the word store concealed an enormous machine. Buying departments selected goods. Factories produced to specifications. Freight moved the merchandise. Headquarters gathered reports. District managers inspected displays. Store managers watched sales. Clerks kept the counters orderly. Customers carried away objects that cost a nickel or a dime. The format had made limitation feel like abundance. A fixed price narrowed the merchant's options, but it gave the customer an unusually clear promise. If the item was on the 5-cent table, its price wasn't a mystery. If it was on the 10-cent line, the customer knew what the transaction would require. The price ceiling functioned as a form of trust. It also became a problem when the outside world changed. For decades, Woolworth retained a 10-cent price limit. A 1979 New York Times account described the company as having held to the limit for 53 years. The phrase 5 and 10 became part of American speech. But the literal ceiling weakened gradually. Some 15-cent merchandise was present by 1916. In the spring of 1932, the company added a 20-cent line. On November 13, 1935, the directors decided to discontinue selling price limits altogether. The name remained after the rule disappeared. 5 and 10, 5 and dime. The words began to describe a format and a memory more than an exact price policy. The decision wasn't caused by the marble staircase or by the founders' private spending. The pressures were commercial. Inflation, especially during the First World War, pushed retail prices sharply upward. Between 1914 and 1919, retail prices rose by almost 80%, according to the period research summarized by Peter Scott and James Walker. Manufacturers changed. Freight costs changed. Labor and rent changed. The number of goods that could be sourced, displayed, and sold profitably for 10 cents became smaller. The fixed price that simplified life for the customer became a restriction on the buyer. A 10-cent ceiling couldn't absorb every cost increase. It couldn't accommodate every new product. It couldn't persuade a manufacturer to continue making an article at a price that no longer covered the factory's own expenses. Woolworth held on longer than most major variety chains. Research on the American five and dime sector shows that many competitors had already moved beyond 10 cents by the 1920s. By the late 1930s, most had raised their limits to $1 or more, or abandoned price limits entirely. The important point is that low-price stores had not suddenly become useless. Scott and Walker's study found that low-ceiling variety stores remained viable during the 1930s and often produced higher profit margins than chains that adopted higher price limits. The movement upward was largely a response to saturation in the low-price niche. There weren't infinite customers for the same narrow range of nickel and dime goods.
Once the chains had spread across the available towns and streets, growth became difficult without either taking business from another five and dime or selling a wider and more expensive assortment. This created the first major drift away from the founding logic. The original model succeeded through standardization. It selected goods that fit a price, displayed them openly, bought them in volume, and paid managers according to results. The mature companies sought growth through complexity. Higher price points created room for new merchandise. They also created new service requirements. A customer buying a piece of hardware could inspect it on a table. A customer buying clothing might need a fitting room, advice, a wider range of sizes, and a return policy. A customer buying fashion goods might care about brand, cut, season, and presentation in a way that a customer buying a spool of thread didn't. The store had to move upward on what retail historians call the service cost continuum. It was no longer enough for the item to be visible. The company needed to explain why the item was worth more. That meant more trained employees, more complicated inventory, more uncertain demand, and more direct competition with department stores and specialty chains. The old strength was volume. The new challenge was judgment. For a time, Woolworth preserved a second source of daily traffic through its lunch counters. By the 1940s, nearly 1,000 American stores had lunch counters serving sandwiches, coffee, shakes, candy, and daily specials. A customer could shop and eat under the same roof. The counter gave the store a social function as well as a commercial one. A child could be brought in for a treat. An office worker could stop for lunch. A shopper could sit down after moving through the aisles. The lunch counter became part of the memory of Woolworth. It also became part of the country's history. On February 1, 1960, 4 students from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University sat at the segregated Woolworth lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. They were refused service. The sit-in became a landmark event in the civil rights movement. The Greensboro counter was a commercial fixture and a public boundary. Its history included sandwiches and coffee, but also exclusion enforced in an ordinary place where customers were expected to sit. The Smithsonian later preserved an 8-foot section of the counter. That history can't be separated from the chain's business identity. Woolworth stores were embedded in American towns. They served as shopping places, lunchrooms,
seasonal destinations, and gathering points. They also reflected the racial order of the communities in which they operated. The store could feel democratic to one customer and closed to another. Its public importance made the disappearance more intimate. When a Woolworth store closed, a business vanished. But so did a familiar stop in the daily geography of the town. The retail geography itself was changing. After the Second World War, automobile ownership and suburbanization shifted the center of shopping. Downtown streets no longer held the same monopoly over daily errands. Shopping centers offered parking and larger floor areas. Enclosed malls gathered department stores, food service, specialty retailers, and discount chains into a new environment. A customer's route had changed. The old Woolworth location might still be convenient for someone walking through a downtown district. It was less convenient for a family driving from a suburb to a shopping centre with free parking and several stores under one roof. This wasn't one competitor's victory. It was a new map. Supermarkets began carrying categories once associated with five and dimes: household supplies, school goods, seasonal items, toys, personal products, and small hardware. Department stores offered broader assortments. Specialty chains offered deeper expertise.
Discount chains offered larger stores and increasingly aggressive prices. Kresge, once a fellow variety store operator, developed Kmart. Dayton's developed Target. Sam Walton opened his first Walmart store in 1962. These businesses didn't merely copy Woolworth. They moved parts of the low-friction idea into larger formats. The customer could park near the entrance. The customer could push a cart. The customer could buy food, household goods, clothing, and seasonal merchandise in one trip. The shopping journey became more efficient even when the store became larger. Woolworth had pioneered accessible displays, but its early form of self-service was limited. Customers could handle goods at open counters, while clerks still completed much of the transaction. Woolworth experimented with supermarket-style self-service in the early 1950s. In Britain, the first fully self-service Woolworth store opened in 1955. Yet only about 1/5 of British stores had adopted full self-service by the late 1950s or early 1960s. Many retained clerk-assisted arrangements. The distinction is crucial. Woolworth had reduced friction at the display. New competitors reduced friction across the whole visit. The customer no longer wanted only to touch the merchandise. The customer wanted to enter, collect goods from several categories, pay efficiently, and leave. The old counter was optimized for browsing and small transactions. The newer store was optimized for movement. A company that had once made the product easy to reach now had to redesign the entire journey. The response was mixed. In 1962, Woolworth created Woolco, a larger discount store format. The same year, Kresge opened Kmart, Dayton's opened Target, and Sam Walton opened his first Walmart. The larger format gave Woolworth more room and a chance to meet the new discount competitors. It also moved the company further from the compact downtown counter that had been its original strength. In 1963, Woolworth purchased the G.R. Kinney Company for approximately $45 million. Kinney became a wholly owned subsidiary. The acquisition made strategic sense. Shoes were a large retail category. Specialty divisions could give Woolworth access to newer customers and new locations. Kinney developed Styleco in 1967 and Susie Casuals in 1968. In 1974, Kinney launched Foot Locker in City of Industry, California, east of Los Angeles. Foot Locker specialized in athletic footwear and apparel. The distinction between Foot Locker and the traditional Woolworth store was immediate. The general store offered a little of everything. Foot Locker offered a defined category. The general store invited the customer to browse for a need that might not yet have been stated. Foot Locker met a customer who had already identified a purpose: athletic shoes, athletic clothing, or the equipment associated with that activity. The specialty store could deepen its assortment without losing its identity. The variety store had once been powerful because breadth was convenient. By the 1960s and 1970s, breadth could look like vagueness. Woolworth faced supermarkets on one side, department stores on another, discount chains above it, and specialty retailers at the edges. It owned many forms of retail, but ownership didn't guarantee that each form remained relevant. The company's problem wasn't simply that customers had developed new tastes. Taste changed. Fashion changed. Branded goods became more important to many shoppers. But the external changes didn't make failure inevitable. A retailer could adapt to suburban locations. It could modernize the store. It could sharpen the assortment. It could decide which customers and categories it wanted to serve. The deeper difficulty was translation. Woolworth had to translate its old promise of inexpensive access into the language of parking, malls, self-service, larger assortments, and category expertise. It attempted several translations at once.
That made the organization more complicated precisely when its old identity was losing clarity. By 1982, company leadership under Mr. Lin was discussing revised store manager contracts that would give managers a greater share of store profits. Management also considered merchandising prototypes tailored to different store categories and new return on capital standards. The proposals were significant because they acknowledged a real problem. Not every store served the same market. Not every location could support the same assortment. Not every manager could be judged by one national template. The company was trying to return responsibility to the local store. But the reforms came after the pressure had become severe. The original manager had been close to the business because the business was the counter. Later managers operated within a portfolio of formats, subsidiaries, malls, departments, and corporate priorities. The distance had grown. Distance between the buying office and the local customer. Distance between the familiar store name and the actual price policy. Distance between the old downtown location and the new suburban shopping route. Distance between a broad assortment and a clearly defined reason to visit. The company wasn't indifferent to change. Its problem was that every response had to pass through a much larger organization. A small merchant could change the front table in one afternoon. A national chain needed a prototype, a capital budget, a distribution decision, a manager contract, a store plan, and a corporate argument. The original system had turned local observation into national scale. The mature system increasingly turned national scale into delayed local observation. That delay mattered. In the traditional variety store model, the manager needed to keep only the fastest-selling lines. Low prices depended on rapid turnover. But a company moving into fashion and higher-value merchandise had to tolerate slower sales, larger inventories, and more uncertain demand. The cost of adaptation increased. The old system had rewarded certainty. The new system required experimentation. The old system had avoided head-on competition by separating territories. Higher value merchandise brought Woolworth directly into competition with department stores and specialty retailers. The company could either build larger stores, enter smaller communities, create new formats, or accept lower margins. Each solution carried a cost. Some smaller stores were less efficient because they couldn't generate enough sales. Larger stores demanded more investment and more merchandise. Higher price points brought the company into markets where established competitors already had experience. Growth became more difficult to finance through the old formula. By 1989, Woolworth was pursuing an aggressive strategy of multiple specialty formats in enclosed shopping malls. The intention was to place several concepts in the same mall and replace one if it failed. The company hoped to operate 10 specialty stores in each major American shopping mall. That target was never achieved. Woolworth didn't develop enough successful concepts to fill the proposed network. The strategy treated the mall as a portfolio of interchangeable identities. The 5 and 10 had asked a simpler question: what useful goods can be sold repeatedly at a low price? The mall strategy asked how many different retail concepts could be placed in the same building. Scale had become a substitute for clarity. The company also attempted Woolworth Express, a smaller, mall-oriented format stocked with everyday convenience items such as health and beauty aids, greeting cards, snack foods, cleaning supplies, and school supplies. The idea recognized that customers still needed small, inexpensive items. But the new format no longer had the unmistakable price architecture of the old counter.
It was a specialty variety store in a world increasingly full of specialty stores. The promise was becoming harder to describe. A consumer could still find something useful inside, but usefulness alone wasn't enough. The store had to tell the customer why it was the right place to look. The old Woolworth sign had done that work. The later assortment often didn't. The decline, then, can't be assigned to one executive, one competitor, one technology, or one decision. Inflation damaged the old price structure. Suburbanization weakened the downtown location strategy. Shopping malls changed customer movement. Supermarkets absorbed everyday categories. Kmart, Target, Walmart, department stores, and specialty chains altered the competitive field. Fashion and branded merchandise demanded different capabilities. Self-service conversion was slow and uneven. The corporate response became more complicated. All of these pressures belonged in the explanation. The familiar verdict is that customers simply stopped liking Woolworth. That is too narrow. Customers changed the places where they shopped, the categories they expected to find, the speed they wanted from a transaction, and the kinds of brands they trusted. Woolworth still had assets. It had buying power. It had locations. It had experienced managers. It had a famous name. It had a large corporate structure and several specialty businesses. The difficulty was converting those assets into a clear customer promise. By October 15, 1993, the situation had become public and severe. Woolworth announced a restructuring plan that included closing half of more than 800 general merchandise stores in the United States. The network contracted. Canadian operations were shifted, in large part, toward a closeout business. Woolco's American operations had already closed in 1983. A store chain does not vanish in one dramatic instant. It thins. One location closes, then another. The merchandise is marked down. Fixtures are removed. Employees leave. The sign remains for a little longer, then comes down. The customer discovers that the nearest store is no longer there. In 1997, Woolworth closed its remaining American department stores. The final U.S. variety stores shut their doors on July 17th. The American business had lasted roughly 118 years. There was no single final object that represented the end. No one nickel was placed on a counter as the last transaction. The ending occurred through ordinary closures, empty shelves, discounted goods, removed fixtures, and a familiar name disappearing from streets where it had once seemed permanent. The corporate name changed soon afterward. On June 12, 1998, Woolworth Corporation became Venator Group. The Latin word meant hunter. The old retail identity was now too closely connected to a business the company had abandoned. The Woolworth Building also left the company's hands in 1998. The tower remained in New York, but the business that had made it famous no longer occupied it as its central symbol. The company had not disappeared entirely. It had narrowed. On October 20, 2001, Venator Group became Foot Locker, Inc. The legal continuation of the company founded by Frank Winfield Woolworth was now named for the athletic division launched through Kinney in 1974. That was the final corporate irony. The broad counter died. The focused store survived. Foot Locker wasn't a five and dime. It didn't sell sewing supplies, household goods, toys, candy, jewelry, Christmas ornaments, school supplies, and small tools beneath one universal, low-price promise. Its survival does not prove that one format could have saved all of Woolworth. It shows something more limited and more useful. A focused retail promise remained viable. The customer entering Foot Locker knew what kind of problem the store addressed. Athletic shoes, athletic apparel, a defined category, a recognizable customer, a reason to return.
The broad Woolworth store had once possessed the same clarity in a different form. Its category was ordinary access. The customer entered because useful things were nearby, visible, and inexpensive. The store made small needs manageable. It allowed the shopper to browse without embarrassment, compare without negotiation, and leave with several modest purchases. The product wasn't the spool of thread. It wasn't the toy. It wasn't the bottle of perfume, the household tool, the Christmas ornament, or the sandwich at the lunch counter. Those were the objects through which the product became visible. The deeper product was trusted access. A Woolworth customer didn't need to know which factory made a hairbrush. The customer didn't need to know how the company negotiated with a manufacturer or how many stores were included in the buying order. The customer needed to trust that the company had already done the difficult work. Someone had selected the item. Someone had secured a price. Someone had placed it within reach. Someone had decided that the counter deserved the space. The sign reduced price uncertainty. The open display reduced social uncertainty. The broad assortment reduced the number of stores required. The local manager reduced the distance between a national chain and a particular town. The buying office reduced the cost behind the price. The downtown location placed the merchandise inside the customer's daily route. The lunch counter added food, rest, and social contact. Together, these parts created a retail service that was easy to underestimate because it felt ordinary. That was Woolworth's achievement. It made ordinary buying less demanding. The early company had removed friction by fixing prices, opening displays, concentrating useful categories, buying at scale, and holding local managers responsible for the condition of the store. The later company preserved parts of the machine, but weakened the connection between them. The price name survived after the ceiling vanished. The assortment remained broad, after breadth became harder to distinguish from confusion. The company owned stores after the customer's route moved elsewhere. The organization employed managers after decisions had traveled farther from the counter. The corporate structure expanded even as the original promise became less clear. This is why scale alone didn't save Woolworth. Scale can lower costs. It can increase purchasing power. It can spread a format across cities and countries. It can pay for headquarters, distribution, advertising, and acquisitions. But scale can also slow the act of noticing. A local manager sees that a display is failing. A headquarters department sees the report weeks later. A customer needs a new kind of item. A buying office sees a category after competitors have already filled it. A town changes. A store plan remains. The original Woolworth system was large enough to buy nationally and close enough to observe locally. Its later structure was large enough to possess many options and slow enough to use them imperfectly. The founding discipline had been narrow. The mature empire became broad. The same repetition that built the chain became inertia when repetition was no longer enough. There is also a social dimension to the memory of Woolworth. A national chain could feel local because the store appeared on the same kind of street, with the same kind of counters, under the same kind of sign. The customer might know the manager. A child might recognize the toy department. A family might remember a lunch counter stool. A shopper might know exactly where the sewing goods or seasonal displays would be found. The business was standardized from above and experienced from below. That combination is difficult to maintain. The store had to be the same enough to be trusted and different enough to serve the town in which it stood. Manager incentives, reporting, and promotion from within helped bridge that distance. They didn't eliminate the tension. A manager paid according to trading results could keep close watch on sales and stock. But the evidence does not establish one uniform American formula across every period. Nor does it prove that incentives always produced the same customer experience. The principle was still visible. The chain's low prices required local attention. The store couldn't be managed only from a distant office. That principle became more important as the chain grew and more difficult to preserve. By the time Woolworth began trying to restore manager profit sharing and create store-specific merchandising prototypes in the 1980s, the organization had already spent years moving away from the simple counter. The reforms weren't meaningless. They were late. A company can recognize the need for local judgment and still be too slow to rebuild it. The history of Woolworth is therefore not a morality tale about an eccentric founder who spent too much money. The Napoleonic costume remains an unverified story. Winfield Hall's marble and gold don't explain the closing of the stores. Nor is the story a simple warning against expansion. Woolworth had to expand to make purchasing power work. Its stores became successful because the format could be repeated across small towns, mid-sized cities, and larger urban markets. The problem came when repetition outlived the conditions that made the format useful. A 5-cent table made sense when the price itself was unusual, when goods were hidden behind counters, when many communities lacked broad assortments, and when downtown streets concentrated daily movement. A higher price line, a larger store, a mall, a supermarket, a specialty chain, and a self-service checkout each changed one part of that environment. Woolworth responded in pieces. Its competitors changed the entire experience. The difference was cumulative. A store that was slightly less convenient, slightly less distinctive, slightly less clear, and slightly slower
could still survive for years. But the customer's reason for returning weakened one visit at a time. The company's 1993 restructuring made the loss visible. The 1997 closures made it final. The counter had once solved a problem before the shopper had to name it. By the end, the corporation was offering too many answers to too many customers through too many formats. The old sign had been a form of compression. 5 and 10 told the customer what the store was, what the merchandise would cost, and what kind of shopping trip to expect. Once the exact price limits disappeared, Woolworth needed another form of compression. It needed a renewed promise. It never found one broad enough to replace the original and sharp enough to compete with specialists. The surviving corporation found a narrower answer in athletic retail. In 2025, Dick's Sporting Goods announced the acquisition of Foot Locker, Inc. The transaction concerned a modern athletic retailer, not the return of the American five and dime, but the lineage remained. The company that began with a 5-cent table continued under a name built around shoes. The descendant wasn't the broad empire, it was the focused branch. That distinction is the lesson left by Foot Locker. A large company can preserve capital, real estate, trademarks, and corporate history. Those assets matter. They aren't the same as relevance. Relevance comes from a promise the customer can still recognize. Winfield Hall remains in Glen Cove as a historic estate. It was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1979. The property changed hands after Woolworth's death, served other uses, and was sold to a private buyer for $8.25 million in February 2022. The Woolworth Building remains at 233 Broadway.
It's no longer the tallest building in the world, but its Gothic tower still records the height to which a humble counter rose. The Greensboro lunch counter survives in the Smithsonian. Its preserved section holds a history of commerce, segregation, protest, and public change. Former Woolworth buildings remain in scattered American towns. Some became restaurants, offices, museums, antique stores, or other businesses. The uses changed, the architecture sometimes remained. The Woolworth name survives in books, photographs, company records, preserved signs, and the language of the five and dime. Foot Locker, Inc. became the principal corporate successor, carrying the legal history into a business far removed from the original general merchandise chain. The physical assets endure in different forms. The institutional memory is less stable. That is where personal recollection matters. One person remembers a lunch counter, another remembers a toy department. Someone else remembers Christmas ornaments, candy, perfume, a spool of thread, or the location of the store on a particular main street. Some remember the layout, some remember the smell of coffee and sugar. Some remember the fluorescent light, the glass counters, the seasonal displays, or the small object that could be bought without asking permission from a clerk. Those memories shouldn't be used as proof that every Woolworth store was identical. The assortment varied, the experience varied. Some customers were excluded from spaces others remember fondly. Memory supplies texture, not a substitute for the record. But the memories point towards something the numbers alone can't capture. A national company could become part of an ordinary routine. The marble staircase at Winfield Hall once cost $2 million. A 5-cent table built the fortune that paid for it.
That contrast isn't merely a story about extravagance. It's a record of two scales operating at once. In private life, Woolworth could spend millions on stone. In public retail, the company had to make a penny or two of profit on each object and repeat the transaction thousands of times. The fortune was created at the counter. Its value lay in what the counter made possible. A customer could buy a useful thing without bargaining. A town could gain access to a wider assortment without becoming a major city. A child could browse. A worker could enter with a small budget and leave without embarrassment. A family could combine necessities, treats, and seasonal purchases in one stop. The company's achievement wasn't that everything was cheap forever. That was never possible. The price ceiling eroded, costs changed, the merchandise changed, the country changed. The achievement was that for a long period, Woolworth kept the customer's uncertainty low. The sign told the price. The table showed the goods. The assortment offered choice. The buying machine made the price possible. The manager kept the store alive. The location made the visit practical. The customer crossed the threshold. Then the company lost the connection. It preserved the name after the price rule had changed. It expanded the organization after local judgment had become more important. It entered new formats without giving each one a clear identity. It watched competitors redesign the shopping trip and answered with a portfolio of partial solutions. Woolworth didn't fail because it became too large in a single dramatic moment. It failed because its size made renewal slower than change. The fortune deserves judgment by its use. Woolworth widened access to everyday goods. It created employment. It organized a national buying system. It helped turn browsing into a normal part of retail. It also operated within the racial exclusions of its era, and its later corporate choices left many communities without a familiar, low-cost shopping place. The record contains achievement and limitation together. Its rise was built on a promise that ordinary customers could understand. Its decline began when the company could no longer make that promise feel current. Foot Locker's survival sharpened the point. The corporation didn't need to remain a five and dime to endure. It needed a clear reason for the customer to return. The focused store found one. The broad empire didn't. Winfield Hall remains behind its gates. The Woolworth Building still rises above Broadway. The Smithsonian still holds the lunch counter. Somewhere in the old record, the red tablecloth remains. 2 wooden tables, attractive goods placed toward the front, and a sign telling the customer that the articles on the table cost 5 cents. The table was modest. The discipline behind it wasn't. Enter, look, choose, pay. That short movement built an empire. When the movement became uncertain, the empire began to recede. A price can start an empire, but only a renewed promise endures.